I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
Enormously kind, and I always love being at the Manhattan Institute and City Journal events. I can't tell you how much I feel at home here. By that, I don't mean the Harvard Club. I mean being around people who care so passionately about the city and believe in using rational thought as a means to actually improve the city. Now, my presentation is going to be considerably more upbeat than, say, EJ's presentation earlier. In part because I'm going to look at things from the perspective of the economy rather than the government. I mean, I certainly believe very strongly that the heart of New York City is the private entrepreneurs and independent workers who make its economy, make its society, make the whole city run, rather than our leaders in government. And things, I think, luckily look somewhat better from the private perspective than they do from the public perspective. Certainly, no one could deny that finance had become an enormously large part of the New York economy. In 2006, finance and insurance made up 40% of Manhattan's payroll. Securities and commodity contracts made up 28%. That's a very narrow sliver of industry, and yet it made up 28% of Manhattan's payroll. Obviously, a significant hit to these industries has an enormous impact on the city, and we certainly shouldn't underpin that. On the other hand, of course, it's too much concentration in one industry isn't necessarily a good thing either. So there's certainly more than one bright lining in these recent events. This is what's happened to the unemployment rate over the last 30-odd years. The dotted line is New York City. The solid line is the United States. And unquestionably, we've had a very significant rise in the unemployment rate from 5 to the latest numbers for the city are 8.7%. One of the things, though, of course, that's interesting about this graph is that with the exception of a brief period in 1982 and then a brief period in the late 1980s, the New York number has generally been higher than the number for the U.S. as a whole. And that reflects, of course, the fact that New York has so often attracted people with less human capital because it provides the economic opportunity that it does. One of New York's enduring strengths is that it creates a place where people who start with less can do better, and that has been correlated with higher unemployment rates in the past. Of course, somewhat amazingly, despite the fact that the financial services sector was the locus of our current downturn, the city has in fact got a lower unemployment rate than the country does as a whole. This is housing prices, and again, the picture is one of a downturn, but again, one that's less severe than the country as a whole. In fact, New York, despite last month's numbers, which were not good, New York is still doing better than any of the other 20 Case-Shiller metro markets relative to 2000 in terms of its housing prices. Clearly, people are still betting on the city as we go forward. Now, from a broader historical perspective, this is certainly a shock, but New York's seen lots of shocks. New York has had a history that is not an unblemished road of eternal successes. We had a shock when the Dutch lost to the English. We had a shock of Leisler's rebellion. We had a shock in 1783, which I'll come back to in a second, when the British left. We had a shock in 1863 when we were the site of the bloodiest riot in American history. We had a shock in 1907 during the financial crisis of that year. Another shock in 1929. Heck, the whole 1970s, when I grew up in the city, felt like a shock from beginning to end. And of course, the popping of the 1987 crash was a pop. That was the crash that actually got me into academia instead of coming here to work on Wall Street. That was the year that I graduated, but that was certainly a shock. And of course, the popping of the internet bubble was a shock, and 9/11 was a shock. And yet, time after time, the city has proven remarkably resilient, remarkably able to reinvent itself. And certainly the case that I'm going to make is that reinvention has to do with the region's ability to attract extraordinary people who then exploit the core comparative advantages of this city, which is its density, its ability to connect people, and its access to the world. New York today, as it has been for 200, 300 years, has been the gateway between America and the world around us. And those things aren't going away. The ability of New York's density to make smart people even smarter because we learn from each other, that's not becoming less important. This recession is not changing the returns to being incredibly knowledgeable the returns to being innovative. That will persist. And certainly, the recession is not going to change the growing trend towards a more globalized economy and a world in which other countries, China, India, are going to be increasingly important in the economy of the world. New York, because it is America's gateway, stands, I think, to play a larger role in the future rather than a smaller one.